Hey, welcome to our first talk about React. I'm sure we've been waiting for this one. So how many people came to the bootcamp specifically to learn about React? Anyone? Yeah, a few people. Yeah, React is very popular, and it's one of several front-end libraries that are used these days. So, all right, so let me do a quick screen share and we'll carry on. So welcome to our first talk on React. And has anybody, by the way, Googled what is React? Anybody done that? Anybody not done that? so, uh, so that's the first thing we want to know is what is React? Let's just ask our good friend Google, what is React? And we go to the React docs. It says React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Well, that doesn't tell me much, but the keyword is it's a library and you build user interfaces. So that tells me that we're building something that users interface with. It is a building applications for the browser. And it is component-based. So declarative, component-based, learn once, write anywhere. Well, that sounds like marketing to me, but these are true, declarative and component-based. So great. So we got a bit of an idea of what React is. So, okay. So we're going to cover the following things today. We're going to talk about, well, a little bit more about what React is, and particularly the virtual DOM, and a bit of a discussion about components. We'll talk about the anatomy of a React application, because that's pretty important to understand just how these things work. Because the worst thing to have is a library that's magic, that you have no idea how it works. It makes it very difficult to write applications for it. So we're going to dive down and understand just how React actually does what it does. And it's actually not that difficult. React, some argue, is much easier than something like jQuery because it's smaller. There's actually a lot less to remember in React than there is in other libraries such as jQuery. And how many people like jQuery? Yeah, jQuery is awesome, right? You know, insert, append, prepend, DOM, all that fun stuff. Well, React really is much easier. What makes React a little more difficult to implement is the JavaScript. You need to know your JavaScript. If you're a little shaky on JavaScript, you should practice a little more, specifically week 1. Anybody remember that music library exercise we did? That one is critically important. I encourage you to do that one again, because you will see this exact object again in our scheduler app for React. So although React is relatively simple, it's the JavaScript that gets you passing functions down as parameters, calling them, and the results get passed back up to the parents, understanding how that all happens. That's not React. That's just JavaScript. React itself is only really a handful of things we need to know, and we're going to cover almost all of those today. Okay, so we'll talk a bit about how to create our own React app using NPX. You get a nice Create React App script for free. We'll talk about components again in the React sense, and we'll talk a little bit about the anatomy of a component, what makes a React component. We'll talk about JSX, which, as we know, is the core of React. It really is the React language. And we'll do some examples of some common components, buttons, inputs, lists. These are all common things that React developers write. Then we'll talk about state as part of this. And as part of this, we'll also talk about props and attributes, because I know everyone is asking, what the heck is a prop? What's this prop thing that just drives me crazy and I can't figure out? we will beat that one to death, believe me, today. So, all right. Okay. So one thing that makes React really fast is the virtual DOM. Has anybody heard of the virtual DOM? And a bunch of stuff in your web page. This is your DOM. And when your browser renders something, it is actually rendering this. It's a tree. It's actually XML. And it's a type of XML called HTML. And it's all pointy brackets. So it's a bunch of pointy brackets. So this is the real DOM. It's in your browser. Okay, and what React does, it keeps a copy. You have the real DOM in your browser, and React keeps a copy of that in memory. And it's an exact copy. There we go. Okay. So it's called a lightweight representation because it doesn't have all the graphical stuff. It's just a memory version of the document object model in memory. Now, this is the key point. The real DOM is very, very slow in CPU terms to update. It takes a lot of effort to change anything on that real DOM in the browser. It's incredibly expensive. So in jQuery, when you say, oh, let's just append this to that container, although it appeared to happen really fast, in fact, that is a very expensive operation. It took a considerable amount of time. In fact, if you want some context, the time it takes to insert one of those tweets into your tweet container, we could have built 10,000 objects in the real or in the virtual DOM. So that's the comparison. Just to insert one tweet in that tweet container, we could have built 10,000 objects in our virtual DOM in memory. So it's much, much faster to manipulate things in the virtual DOM. Okay. And when a state changes, the virtual DOM changes that object in the real DOM only. Let's look at an example of how that works. So here's our real DOM. This is in our browser. So this is our Chrome, Firefox, or Edge. And there's our, let's say that's our head. And maybe we've got some, our body and our head there, or other head, HTML, body, head. There we go. And we make a change to, let's say, our body. Maybe this is a list of some kind. So we change these two elements, okay, in our virtual DOM. Notice nothing has changed in our browser yet because we're in React. Whenever we change anything, it gets changed in this virtual DOM. And by the way, this all happens behind the scenes. You don't see any of this happening yourself. But when a change happens, React compares that change to the real DOM that it knows is in the browser. And it wants to know, or it determines, what specific change has happened. And what it does, it applies a patch to the real DOM. It doesn't rebuild the whole real DOM or regenerate it. It simply patches it with a very small bit of code in memory. And that's what happens. And then you end up with the same DOM. It's much, much faster. And that's one of the reasons that React is really, really fast. It's because we're not changing the DOM every time we change something. Oftentimes in jQuery, you do paint the whole page. Every time you make a change in jQuery, you are in effect painting that page again. For an example, I wrote an application about 1.5 years ago. It was a check scanning application. I was writing an application for banks to scan some checks using these little printers they feed through. Kind of all these checks fly through the scanner, 1 a second or 2 a second, pretty fast. And I wrote, it wasn't hard to write because I was using a third-party library. So I wrote the code myself in React, and it was great. But the library I was using, they gave an example in jQuery. So just for fun, I sure, I'll write really the same thing or a demo version of the same thing in jQuery. And it worked, but I put them side by side, and the difference was quite amazing. With the jQuery version, when I was using a scanning simulator, which could do like 10 per second, you could see the screen just flash, 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 flash. It was really hard on the eyes because as I was scanning these checks, I was rendering the check on the screen at the same time. So every time a check scanned, the screen would flash or flicker, really hard to watch. But in the React version of the same code, it was just smooth. Things just blended. They transitioned from one to the other. It was really really amazing to watch. So React is really, really fast. And the reason for that is the virtual DOM, because we do everything in the virtual DOM, and React converts that or patches our real browser DOM. All right. Let's look at the anatomy of a React app. Now, does anybody remember jQuery? It's only been a week, of course. So what files did we need for a jQuery app? What do we need? Really need, at a minimum, 2 files, don't we? We would need an index HTML with our HTML or the beginnings of it. And then we'd need our, let's call it index.js. That will allow us to change things, add things to our index HTML. We might have also had a CSS file. Okay. So in React, I have here a minimal app. I wrote this little project called React Minimal, which contains the bare minimal that you need to run a React app. And surprisingly, it also has 2 files in it. It has an index.html and it has an index.js. I think, well, these must be much more complicated than jQuery because, of course, React is a much more powerful library. So these files must be just amazingly complicated, have a lot of code in them. Well, let's take a look. So there is our index.html. There is not a lot going on there, is there? Let's look at our index.js. Maybe that's got some really complicated code in it. Not really. Okay, so let's just unpack both these files. So let's start with index.html. What I have is an index file, which has a head. Nothing exciting there. That's just your basic head with a title and a char set. So nothing exciting going on here. And then I have a body. And look at that. There's really nothing inside that body. In fact, this is way simpler than any jQuery app that I've ever written, for sure. Body and a div, and that's it. And I've got a div with an ID of root, and it's empty. Well, we're used to seeing that. We've seen that before in our tweet container. We had our div also, we called it tweet container. It was also empty, and we inserted things into that div. So if you're thinking that maybe React does the same thing, you'd be exactly right. React does, in fact, insert things into that div. In fact, it inserts the entire application inside that div with an ID of root. So you don't need an awful lot to have a React app. You just need to have somewhere in your HTML some container. It can be a div, a span, a p, it doesn't matter what it is, just some container that has some ID, doesn't have to be called root, that you can look at. That's all. And by the way, you could in fact have more in your HTML. We commonly don't because there's no need, but you certainly could have a much more or much larger index HTML with a bunch of other stuff, and you could have your React embedded in your page. There's nothing to say you can't do that. You could have a whole, even a jQuery app, although that would be a little bizarre, that has a little div in there and you inject some React stuff into it. Not commonly done, but completely possible. All right. Well, there's our index.html. Nothing to it. This has a container, and that's all. Let's look at our index.js. All right. So a bunch of comments. talk about that in a second. So I'm importing this React DOM object, and that's who's doing all the work. It's this React DOM object, and that's going to really bootstrap my app for me. And then I have a function here that looks doing some funky stuff here. We'll talk about that later. This is actually a component. It's a component called app. Okay. So I have a component called app, which is just a JavaScript function. So I'm declaring some JavaScript function that looks like it returns something there. It looks kind of like HTML. And that's the end of my function. And then I'm calling this React DOM render function. And this is what React is doing for you. This is the render function, which, by the way, you never need to worry about. So although I'm going to talk about this, you do not have to worry about actually calling this function yourself. It is done once, ever, in your React app. We're just going to talk about what it is and how it's doing what it does and why it's not magic. Okay, there's no magic happening here. So my React DOM object that I got from this module that was imported, I'm calling a render function. It's going to take some element called app. That looks familiar. And it's going to take another parameter as document get element by ID root. Now, who hasn't seen this particular phrase? Document get element by ID. Boy, that's a blast from the past. We did that way back in the prep. We actually used the native JavaScript to get an element by its ID of root. Of course, now with jQuery, we just say, $pound root. It's much easier. But this is the bare metal way, or bare JavaScript way, if you will, of doing the same thing. And that's it. So this React DOM render takes two parameters. It takes a element. In fact, this is a component, and it puts it inside the container. It's the same as doing the following thing. It's saying app, making something called app and putting HTML, and then appending that to that app. So you're appending the app rather to the root ID. So this is what's actually happening in jQuery. It's not magic. We're simply building something and we're putting it inside this container, just like saying $pound root, append that app or append that HTML. And that is all that you have to worry about. Okay. React takes care of everything else. Okay. So this is how a React app is built. We could also have some CSS. We put a CSS file here and some other stuff, but really this is the bare minimum that you need to run a React app. Okay. So we can even start this app. Let's go fire this thing up. Gotta go npm start. Oops. npm start. So how fast my machine is today. That wasn't too bad. And I get hello world. Okay. Probably not surprisingly, because I have a function called app that seems to be returning some stuff. And I have this pointy bracket thing called app, which I'm kind of thinking likely is going to be equal to this markup here. And I'm inserting it in my root div. So this is how React works when it starts up. As I said, you don't have to worry about this line there. That will be in every React app that you have. All you have to worry about is making components. Now, I did mention this is the minimal required to run a React app, but you would not normally do it this way. And there's a couple of reasons, but the biggest reason is that you can't develop on it. If I make a change here, if I say hello React world and save that, that should have changed on me. It didn't change, okay? There's a reason if I refresh my page, sure, that works. But with React, we don't even like to refresh the page. In jQuery, we had to still refresh the page. But really, React developers are even more impatient. They don't even want to have to refresh their browser page. They want to see a change happen instantly. So we can't just have an index.js and an index.html. We need to have another file. We need to have a component that is outside of index.js. And I have a little note here saying Webpack, which we'll talk about in a second, won't be able to detect changes to the app if it's inside index.js. Move app into its own app.js file for real development. And that's what we normally do. Okay, so let me just do that. I'm going to actually undo my changes here. Let's undo those. And I do have another branch. Let's just switch. I've got exactly the same thing here. There. Now all I've done here is I've moved that app function into its own file called app.js. Okay. And if I restart my React app again, it'll look exactly the same. There's no difference. All I've done now is I have moved this app. And this is what you normally see. You've got your index.html, you've got your index.js, which really is a one-liner now. And you never need to touch index.html or index.js, really ever. You never touch them. All you work on is app.js and everything below that. Okay, all right. So this is really a minimal React app. And now when I make a change, by the way, let's change that and save it. And sure enough, it changed on me automatically. And that was Webpack. And we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. Okay, and this is what React developers normally do. You know, they make a change. Yeah, hello world. There we go. Hello world. And your application changes. That's what we're used to seeing. You can only do that if the app.js is its own file. Why? That's kind of beyond the scope of this lecture, but you just need to have it. Okay. All right. So let's talk about making our own React app. Okay. We're going to create our own React app. Has anybody heard of NPX, by the way? Anybody heard of NPX? I think we've all used NPX, haven't we? Just gonna go here, gonna find where's my class? There's my React. Okay. I believe you use NPX with NodeMon or NoDaemon, as I like to say. NPX lets you run an NPM module without actually installing it. Okay. So React, or with the React libraries, comes a particular script. It's called create React app, and it builds a React app for you. This one I wrote by hand. It wasn't hard. Some HTML and a really super simple index.js and a pretty darn simple app.js. That was all I needed. So I wrote this one by hand. And I installed a couple of packages, React, React DOM, and React scripts. Not much to it, okay? But even that can be too hard. So what we can do is we can run the create React app script, and it will do that for us. Let's try that right now. Go npx create dash React dash app, and we'll give it a name. We'll call it my app. Okay. All right. So npx will first go and will get the React scripts that it needs to run this. Great. So, and now it's going to build my React app and all the libraries it needs. It's going to generate really everything I need for a React app. And this, as it says, might take a couple of minutes, which is a bit of an understatement. This can take a while. It's actually going to be installing about 200 megabytes of packages and other stuff in your project, which takes a bit of time. It's installing a complete React development environment on your system. And you may say, well, 200 megabytes, That's a lot of stuff. Does that mean that my page, my application is going to be 200 megabytes? And when users click on my link, they're going to be downloading 200 megabytes? And of course, the answer is no. It's downloading a development environment, including all of the tools that you need to run React, including Webpack and Babel. And I mentioned Webpack before. We'll talk about that really soon here. And Babel, which is the KDMPX. So I'm going to stop this because this is going to take a good few minutes because my machine is not super, super fast. So I'm just going to stop that. There, that was just way too long. What I have done is I made a new one. Okay, there's my app. It's kind of half done there. I made one this morning. Okay, I called it New React App. All right, there's my new React app. Okay, so looks like a regular Node project so far. I have a .git, which you get for free. I have Node modules. I have a public, I have a source, and I have my usual package.json and package log files and a README. Okay, so let's first take a look at those Node modules. And there it is. This is what React installed for us. Look at all that stuff. Our Create React app installed for us. Just tons of stuff, and I'm still on the C's. Look at that. Wow. That's a lot of stuff, I know. Yeah, fortunately, we don't have to worry about it. This is a React development environment that was built for us by the Create React app script. All right. Let's open our new React in VS Code. Okay. There we go. Okay. Let's unpack this one, shall we? Let's take a look. We'll start at the top. Let's just minimize everything, and we get similar to my minimal React app. It has a public folder, and there is, in fact, an index.html inside that. Okay, so far so good. And there is a source folder that has an index.js and an app.js. It has a couple of CSS files, so that's no surprise. It looks like it's got an app.test.js, which we're not going to be doing any testing today, so we don't care. So let's start with the index.html that they build for you. Okay, let's look at that. So index.html, it looks a little longer, doesn't it? But in actual fact, it's exactly the same thing. It's got a head. It's got a whole bunch of stuff in that head and a lot of comments. So, and a lot of the stuff, it's fine. We got, viewport. I got some theme, really a bunch of extra head stuff. Nothing critical, and certainly nothing really essential to running a React app. They just put it in there. We could really do without all of this stuff, and our file would still run just fine. If I deleted all of that, it would still be just fine. They just added some example stuff. For example, maybe you want to have a mobile app and you want to control what icons show on the home page for your mobile app. Well, they added a line for that. Got the mobile there, you got the manifest for having different sizes of icons. So a lot of extra stuff, but really nothing critical to an actual React app. So there's the head. Let's look at the body. It has two things. It has this no script tag, which is interesting. And it has our div. Look, our good old div ID equals root. Okay. And some comment. So really, there's only two things.
Gary,
So,
what
yes.
does the no script tag do?
Yes, great question, huh? Let's talk about the no script tag. I love this one. This is like a cool history lesson in the history of the internet. Okay, and browsers. No script. Back in the day when I was doing programming, back in the day, when the internet first came out and browsers first came out, there was no scripts. So in the beginning, the internet was without script. There was no script. Okay. But then script was invented and people freaked out. It's like, what? there's this thing called JavaScript, and it does what? It runs code inside my computer. Are you kidding me? No, we don't want that. Stop, stop. I want to be able to turn that off. That just sounds so dangerous. As it turns out, they were right. But it was, yeah, no, don't think that's not dangerous. It's just code. It's totally safe running in the browser. Nothing in JavaScript can hurt your IE 2.0. Yeah, sure. So, but okay, tell you what, just to make you happy, we will allow you to turn off your JavaScript in your browser. So Bill Gates said, no problem. Let's add a little switch saying, don't turn on scripts in web pages. Makes everyone happy. No scripts allowed. Okay. So now you've got a browser that does not run JavaScript at all. Everyone's happy again, except the developers. They're going, well, crap, we doing all this cool work and people aren't seeing it. And they're thinking that our web page is broken and they're blaming us. So what can we do? Well, what they did was they added to the HTML language or to the HTML markup, this cool no script tag, which you can probably guess will display the following thing if you do not have JavaScript enabled in your browser. Seems incredible today, doesn't it? But you can, and I have a feeling, I'm pretty sure you can in your browser, even today, turn off your JavaScript completely and nothing will run, but you can do it. So in order for them to tell people, hey, by the way, you probably should turn on your JavaScript. We're not broken. Our page isn't broken. You just don't have your JavaScript turned on. That's what this tag is for, okay? The create React app script adds that for you. So you got it, so might as well, okay? So we can see that this file here looks an awful lot like my index HTML. Just mine looks a lot cleaner, doesn't it? Theirs is just a lot of comments and some Apple stuff, some icon stuff, some theme stuff in the head. But the meat of it, which is the body, is just a div ID root. And that's it with this funky no script tag. Okay. All right. So that's Create React app there. So, okay. Let's look at the rest of this app that they built for you, because there's a couple of other things in it. In the public, you get some image files. You know, those are specific to the demo they build for you. You got a manifest.js, which simply is for mobile apps, allows you to size icons. You don't have to worry about this too much. In fact, I usually delete this stuff unless I'm writing a mobile app. A robots text that controls web crawlers, nothing critical for React. Okay, and a fave icon, which I leave around because I like having a fave icon. Plus a little icon up in my browser. That's kind of fun. Okay, so really the only thing of any note in the public folder is, to no surprise, the index.html, just like we had in my minimal app. Everything else was extra fun stuff they give you when they build this demo for you. Let's look at our source directory. Once again, we have the index.js. Let's open that one, see what's inside. Not much more, is it? There's not a lot much more. They are importing a bunch of stuff, React DOM, React, some CSS, importing my app, Web Vitals, that's kind of an extra library you get. So it's kind of the same as what I did. It's got the React render. It's rendering using this as the target. And all they're doing is simply wrapping their app component in this strict mode thing, which sometimes I just, you don't need it really. Okay, but we'll leave it in there for now. So it's very similar to what we did. And there's our document, get element by ID tag again. So it's the same thing. It's React DOM.render. And they're doing some report Web Vitals thing, measuring performance. So yeah, sure, go ahead.
What does the strict mode do it again? I see it a lot and I haven't quite grasped what it's actually changing.
Let's take a look what that does. React.
Is that something I should go Google, or is that
strict? Well, We know someone who would know that, don't we? Google. Let's find out. Oh, strict mode. What is this? Strict mode is a tool for highlighting potential problems in an application like Fragment. Ah, okay. Does not render. That's kind of cool. Let's take a look. Oh, by the way, there is a drinking game I hear. When I say the word kind of cool or so, we all take a shot, okay? So there's a drinking game, okay? It's like when Justin Trudeau says, or but as in another show. So yes, so you all take a shot if I say it's kind of cool, right? All right. So strict mode, it just highlights some additional problems. It's a kind of a tool to assist you as a developer. You can find more on Google. It's all kinds of cool stuff about it. So, all right. Okay. So I have that. I have my app.js, which is just barely a fancier version of the one I wrote. And that's it. So if we look at my app.js, which was here, I think, where'd it go? There's my app.js. I had a very small app.js. Okay. And here is their app.js. There's not much difference going on there between the two. Just they've got more stuff. Okay. And they've got a logo in here as well. They have some CSS, some test stuff. But really, the meat of it, once again, is an index.js and an app.js. And all the action, as far as you're concerned, takes place in app.js and down. You really rarely need to even look at the index.html or the index.js. As I mentioned before, although it's nice to know how this works, we really don't need to worry about it. We can really just take that public folder, minimize it, and don't look at it, except for some specific cases, which I'll talk about in a few weeks as well. Okay, so app.js. Let's actually fire this app up and see what we get. My new React app. Let's go in there and we're going to start this thing. npm start. It'll be a little slower because it's the first time it's running, I think. Let's take a look. See how fast it starts up. That's not bad. Okay. Look at that. A brand new React app with a spinning atom. That's awesome. Isn't that cool? Take a shot. Okay. That's what you get when you do or you build a new React app with Create React App. You get a really interesting spinning atom. So what a lot of developers do, I mean, it's fun, but that's not what I planned on writing. So what a lot of developers do when they build a Create React app from scratch is they clean up this stuff. So they just delete this stuff. Don't want that. There, delete that. Delete that. Gone. Okay. And they remove files they don't need. I don't need a test. I'm going to delete that. Sure, delete some of these. I don't really care about report web vitals, so I'll remove that from my code. Strict mode, I'll leave it on. So I don't need that there. So I don't need this. You know, they start removing stuff they really don't care about. And they kind of clean up. I don't need a logo anymore, so I can get rid of that. And I'll delete that. I got my index.html, which is calling my logo, all my manifest files, all this stuff. So they do a bunch of cleanup. And I think I've done that in this one too. I think I cleaned it up. Let's just go in here and I've got a branch that I called Clean React App. So I got a couple branches in my code, which by the way, I will give you a copy of this GitHub project. And in my GitHub projects, I have lots and lots of branches. I have a branch called Create React App, which was what you got when you ran Create React App right there. I have a branch called Clean React App, which is a cleaned up version of the React app with all the extra stuff that I felt I didn't need at the time. Okay, so I've cleaned this up. Let's run it again. And my app.js is empty. So this is the starting point for a React app. Okay. And when I add stuff, I could say hello. This HTML, I get hello magically. And the magic is due to two things. One of those is Webpack. Webpack is really like an HTML server. You can think of Webpack as NodeMon on steroids, okay? If this was HTML, I would type in hello world, wouldn't I? And then I go to my browser and I'd refresh the browser, if I spelled it right. Typical development cycle. Change some code, okay, go to my browser, refresh my page. Ah, there it is, back and forth. Not hard, pretty good. Well, what Webpack does, it goes one step farther. It actually establishes a WebSocket connection with your browser, and it does that for you. That's great. Webpack is not unique or not only for React. It's a general purpose, really cool version of NodeMon on steroids. And you can use it anywhere. It just simply detects any change in your application and it will re-render instantly. It's really super convenient. That's Webpack. Let's take a look inside our application and look for Webpack. Webpack, there it is. Lots of Webpack. Webpack conversions, Webpack this, Webpack that, lots of Webpack stuff, okay? But Webpack, that is the server. That's what's actually sending you this information, just like NodeMon was in your other applications in jQuery, okay? So Webpack is detecting my change. So hello, React world. I save that and like, cool, isn't that great? Much more convenient for React development. Once again, we installed a complete React development environment, which includes Webpack. Okay, let's talk a little bit about components. And what are components? There we go. All right. So from a web point of view, what is a component? Well, a component is pretty much anything on that page, isn't it? From an HTML point of view, this page is full of components. There's a component right there. I don't know, it looks like a little, probably a div that I can't see, but it looks like it has two things inside it, two links inside that component. These are components. It's got probably inside here, it's probably a bar, and it's got the components here, a little button component. Well, that's a cool component. I'll click on that. Oh, look at that. That's so really everything's a component. They're all components on my page. It's just a building block of your web page. That's a component, at least from an HTML perspective. From a React component, it's much the same. A React component is or are the building blocks of your web application. I have an application right now. It has one component. It's app. So I have an app component. And you will normally have an app or application component in your React app. I believe in the scheduler, it's called application component. In when you do create React app script, they call it app.js. It's the same thing. So this is a component. I have a one component app. Not terribly complex, but it's a component. Okay, so that's a component. Let's talk about the actual anatomy of a component. A component in React, from a React perspective, a component is a function. And we are doing what is called functional components in React. Let's go back to our friend React or our friend Google and go React functional components versus class. This is a big deal, okay? And something you should remember that we are doing functional components, not class components. Twilio.com. It's kind of cool. New one. What do I have to say? Look, understanding functional components versus class components in React. In the world of React, there are two ways of writing a React component. One uses a function, the other uses a class. functional components are becoming more and more popular. That is complete, very, very, very true. And they talk about why it is. Okay, cool. The takeaway from today is that we will be using functional components. Class components are the original way, or now the older way. It's not deprecated, it's still used, but it is less in favor than functional components. Functional components are the way of the future in React. So we will be doing functional components in our assignment. We do, by the way, touch on class components at the end of next week. We do a little bit of work on class components, but they are much more difficult to understand and much harder to debug. So we use functional components because they are much easier to understand. They're functions. So from our perspective, a React component is, and this is a definition thing, I'll write that down here. A React component is, it is a JavaScript function that returns JSX. That is the definition of a React component. A function that returns JSX. Okay. What's what I have here? I have a function. It's called function app. And it returns, there's a return statement. It'll return something. It returns this stuff, which is JSX. So let's talk a little bit about JSX for a second. And then we'll take maybe a short break and we'll get back to actually writing some code. Okay.
Hey, Gary, just a
Yes.
quick question. I've noticed a couple of times, so on line 12 there, it says export default. Sometimes I see on line 3 export default function app, and then it's not on 12. What's the difference?
Good point. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. You notice that I ran my create React app script. And this is the one it generated. This is really from React, but it has function app. Wow, doesn't that look really old school to you? Like, weren't we told we shouldn't do it that way? Why is React building a function this way? Like, I spent like the last 6 weeks having it beat into me. No, don't do functions that way. Yeah, that is kind of old school. They do it for one kind of what seems like a silly reason, but it has a certain degree of sense. Because they did it this way, that allows them you to do this. And take that and put that there and not have that line. Yeah, okay. Could I have done it this way? Const app equals function? Absolutely, yes. And perfectly fine. You can decide which way you want. Since that this is a single file, we tend to write our React components in a single file. It is going to be really the only function in that file. So it doesn't hurt to have the old school way of that. Plus the fact you can, of course, put export default in front of it. So it doesn't hurt. I don't know, I'm not a big fan of it, but you will see this a lot. It kind of saves you a line, doesn't it? So totally your choice. Although this function is now hoisted, which means it is available to anything in the file, but because this is a component file and there's only one component per file, generally, it doesn't matter. It's the only thing in the file. So having this function written this way is not going to hurt anybody. So I don't know, you know, we can make it this way for now. Const function or const app equals function equals function. Okay, right. So a React component is a function that returns JSX. Okay. By the way, anyone notice how I'm running my React app. Does anybody see my terminal here? No. I would encourage you, if you do not already do so, is to go to your VS Code terminal, move over to the right, and click that little X there, and don't ever open it again, okay? We do not need to even see the terminal at all in our React code. Open yourselves up a terminal window and minimize it. Now, a couple of reasons. We're going to have 3 or 4 terminals open in our React app. So having the terminal running in your VS Code is probably not the best idea. But more importantly, we are software developers, aren't we? We write code. We're coders. The most important thing on my screen is my code. So I don't want anything getting in the way of my code. I do not use that VS Code terminal, okay? You'll see it often used for demonstrations, online videos, but in reality, we don't use it as developers. We just don't, okay? Have a window, we move it around. In the case of React, we minimize it because we don't need to see. Any errors that are going to come up are going to show here, but they're also going to show there. Webpack will display the error in the browser. There's literally no reason to have this terminal open, and certainly no reason to have it in your VS Code. That just makes a big mess of your screen. All right, enough for my soapbox. Okay, so once again, what is a React component? Okay, it is a function that returns JSX. So what is JSX? It's this stuff. It looks an awful lot like HTML, doesn't it? I think I even have a slide. Let's take a look. I think I have a little slide that talks about what is JSX. A little graphic here. Ah, there we go. Cool. So it really is like this. It's JavaScript plus HTML equals JSX. I love this slide. It's so silly. It is. It really is kind of JavaScript and HTML kind of mushed together in one thing. It's not really JavaScript. It's not really HTML. It is kind of both. Here's an example of what JSX looks like. Const simple equals h1 hello world. Now, this is not JavaScript, is it? It couldn't be. Can anyone tell me why this statement could not be JavaScript at all? I'll take caller number 2 on the chat line. Why is this not JavaScript?
You haven't wrapped it.
True. There's a more fundamental reason why it's not JavaScript. Would have to be a string. That's correct. It would have to be a string. This is not JavaScript. If I put this in my Tiny app or even in my Tweeter, it'll break. This is not JavaScript. This is not a string. You cannot assign h1 hello world, close h1 to a string in JavaScript. It is not JavaScript. This is JSX. That part there, that is JavaScript for sure. And that is HTML, the h1 stuff. And of course, the semicolon, that's also JavaScript as well. So it's a combination of both. It is JSX. It is the language of React. So since this is clearly not JavaScript, and we know that browsers really only speak 3 languages, do they? They speak HTML, they can understand HTML, they can understand JavaScript and CSS. So 3 things. So your browser can understand those 3 things. Your browser cannot understand JSX at all. And that is where Babel comes in. I love that word, Babel. Okay. An old biblical story of the Tower of Babel, where people couldn't speak different languages and no one understood each other. Let's look for Babel. There's Babel. A lot of Babel. Babylon. Love that. Cool. So Babel it's called a transpiler. It translates the JSX into something that your browser will understand. So it takes this JSX, which really, in this case, it is all HTML with a little bit of stuff at the end, semicolon. It takes that JSX, converts that to HTML or HTML and JavaScript so your browser can understand it. It really takes that, it sends that to Webpack. Webpack sends it to your browser. Now, once again, these are details of how the inner workings of it works. You don't have to understand this to code React, but it's interesting to know what's going on behind the scenes. So Babel runtime, Babylon, I love that one. It's kind of cool. Oh, take a shot. Okay. All right. So Babel, that does the conversion from JSX to, oops, there we go, actual HTML and JavaScript. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back and we'll start writing some actual components in React. We'll take a look at some common components. Big takeaway from today is JSX is kind of like HTML with some JavaScript thrown in. We'll talk about how it's actually pretty easy. And that a React component is a function that returns JSX. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and we'll come back at the 40 of the hour, and we'll carry on with some cool React stuff. Okay, talk to everyone soon. Okay, so we talked about what a React component was. It is a function that returns JSX. And JSX, as we know, is a combination of HTML and JavaScript. This is JSX. It's not a string, so this would not work in Node, but because we're using the Babel transpiler, I love that name, transpiler. It's such a cool word, transpiler. We're using Babel. It converts this into stuff that our browser can actually read. And by the way, let's take a look at what we're actually seeing in the browser. Let's take a look. We know we have our index HTML. We know we got a head and a no script, and we have a div called root. So if we look at our dev tools, we should have a no script and a div, and in fact we do. We have a no script and a div, and we have some other stuff, okay? But really, as far as markup, we have a no script. Let's make this bigger. And we have our div. Inside our div, what do we have? Let's take a look. We have div class equals app. Hello, React World div. Let's look at our index.js. And there's our app.js. Okay, inside our app.js, we have in fact div class name equals app. Looks very similar to what we have here. So inside your app component, whatever you return, anything you return from your React component is what gets rendered into your browser. In this case, I'm returning div class equals app, hello React World. And I am in fact returning div class name equals app. So we'll talk a bit about JSX. JSX has some rules, and there's a few of them, okay? One of the rules in JSX, which is a pretty simple one, but totally easy to forget, is that if you want to have class equal something, you have to say class name equals that same thing in JSX. That's just one of those things. Why? Who knows? Doesn't matter. You just got to do it, okay? If you put class equals, you're probably going to get a warning. I got a warning. What does it say? It says, oh, invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? Look at that. React is very helpful. When you do something it doesn't like, it's going to try to give you some reasonable warning that you did something wrong and maybe you wanted this instead. And it's like, oh, yes, I did. I meant class name. Oh, sorry about that, React. I forgot. Okay, great. Press the page and all is forgiven. Okay, right. So there's my actual DOM. Here is my application. So it's one-to-one, isn't it? This is exactly what I wanted. So one of the real things about React that's important to remember is it is declarative. It's declarative. Something like jQuery, that's imperative. With jQuery, we had to tell it what to do. We had to say, find the div with an ID of root. We have to go $root and inject this inside it. We had to tell it step by step what to do. With React, we don't have to do that. We simply say, oh, I just want my stuff there. That's all I want. Put my stuff right there in my app. Oh, and maybe put a button there as well. Sure, I want a button there. Oops, I spelled it right. There, put a button. And there's a button. Let's put some text on my button. Text. So now you may have already noticed that this looks an awful lot like something else we've worked with in the past, doesn't it? Does anybody remember EJS? EJS and Tiny App. We had a template, and the template was, that was our page. We constructed our page in our EJS. Well, React is very, very similar to that, in that you build your page. You don't have to construct the page like you do with jQuery and insert things, the loop, for tweet of tweets, build tweet, append tweet, that kind of thing. No, you just say, there is my page. Now, much like EJS, we can also have variables. So let's make ourselves a variable. Const. We'll call it text equals, and we'll say React world. Okay. Now this is JavaScript. This is pure JavaScript. Text equals React world. Okay. Let's use a variable inside our template to use EJS terms. I can use my text variable. Now, if I say text, it's going to say, well, hello, text. That's not very helpful. What would I have had to have done in EJS to get that variable in there? What would I do? Anybody remember? Back in Tiny App, how would I use my variable inside my template? And Victor, yes, that's correct. We'll use pointy bracket %equal. Pointy bracket %equal our text, and then pointy bracket. It's like that, which of course React doesn't understand at all. So we're getting an error. Okay, let's take a look. And by the way, same thing. You notice we talked about the terminal. That's the error. This is why I don't need to look at my terminal at all in a React, at least when I'm coding. Minimize it. You're going to see the errors in your browser. But in EJS, this would have worked. I'd go pointy bracket % equals text. Okay. Well, JSX has something very, very similar. Look at that. I'm getting a helpful thing from VS Code. Unexpected token. Did you mean curly bracket greater than? Kind of helpful. Kind of. So it's being helpful, not the exact answer, but it gives me a clue. It's like, oh, curly bracket. Oh, that's right. there's one of the JSX rules. When you use anything that is JavaScript inside markup, for example, you want to render a variable. The variable here is text, okay? You need to surround that with some curly braces, just like that, there. So we'll call that rule number 1 of React. If you want to use JavaScript, like a variable or anything, an expression, it has to be surrounded by curly braces. And now I have my hello world. Okay. So real important rule. The curly brace, rule number 1 of JSX, anything JavaScript-y that is inside your markup, and this is markup. Markup is anything with pointy brackets. Once you're in the markup world, okay, you're done. JavaScript, you need to do curly braces. That's all. Okay, so if you always wonder, when should I use curly braces? It is when you're inside markup. That's when. Okay. So there's my Hello React world again. So not bad. This is a lot like EJS. I've got my variable and I'm rendering it here. Okay. But wait, there's more. It's even more fun than that. I can also do something else. Let's try something else here. Let's build ourselves a little list. Let's do a UL. Like that. Okay. And I'm going to put an LI. There. I'll say item 1 because I have no imagination. I'll make a few items. 2, 3, 4. Okay. So by the way, I snuck in some extra CSS in here on you. Okay. So that didn't happen by magic. If I deleted that CSS, you wouldn't get that cool formatting. So there, it would look like this. But since I'm so proud of my advanced, actually terrible CSS skills, I put some CSS in there, make it look nice. Okay. So there's a list. No surprise. This is really standard HTML. Okay. What I could do though is I could take those list items. I could put them in a variable. Let's try that. Const list items equals. There, semicolon. Okay. Now, there, let's do this instead. There we go. Little nicer formatting, but I'm getting an error. Look at that. I'm getting an error, failed to compile. Java or React is angry with me. I've done something wrong. It says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. Did you want a fragment? So another rule, when you have more than one item, it must only have a single parent. So any component or any item at all, any JSX must have a single parent. In this case, there's my div for my app. It has a single parent. A UL, single parent. In this case, I have a single div parent. Here, I don't. I've got 4 siblings with no parent. React doesn't like that. That sounds wrong. Children should have parents, okay? So I need to add something. It can be anything. I could have a div. I could have anything I want. I could put a div here. Let's add a div to here. Oops. There. And we'll there. Okay. And now React is happy again. No errors on the screen. Nothing showing because I have nothing showing, but it seems to be happy with that. Let's take a look. Okay. Let's go ahead and put my list items inside my UL. And let's see what happens. List items. Okay. And I get the word list items because rule number 1, I need to have curly braces when I'm inside markup. Okay. All right. Look at that. Let's see what got rendered. Okay. There we go. Okay. It's being way too helpful. So there's my div. And there is my class equals app. There's my UL. And oh, I've got this div inside my UL. I don't like that. It works, but it kind of looks ugly. I don't really want to have a div inside there, do I? Don't like that. I should have UL, then some LIs. So if I delete those divs though, I'm gonna get a really angry React error message saying I've got to have a single parent. So how can I resolve this dilemma? Well, fortunately, with React, you get a special tag. It's called a fragment, and it is just an empty pointy bracket. So I can use that as a container, and it won't render. So now there's my UL, but even though that fragment is there, it doesn't render inside my list. So recall when I got the error message, it said, do you want a fragment? That's what it was referring to. I could use a JSX fragment, which is empty pointy brackets. Okay, all right. Well, so far, this is not so exciting yet because I'm just simply taking some code. I mean, jQuery can do this, can't it? I can say list items equals. I would put a string around it because I can do that in jQuery, and I would insert that. Okay, even though we couldn't do this in EJS, jQuery can do this. I can make a string. Well, backticks here. I can make a string, and jQuery will happily take that and inject that into my code. Okay, all right. Not very useful though, because now it is literally a string. So, but let's do something that jQuery can't do. Okay, what if instead of hard-coded JSX, this was an actual array of items? Let's try that. Let's make it an array of items, an array of LIs. There, clean this up. Okay. Now, of course, an array doesn't need a single parent. Each one of these is a thing all by itself. So each one of these is a JSX thing. It has a single parent, LI. That's why I'm not getting this error, is it? But look what happened. This is an array, but React expanded that array for me by magic. And simply, there's my array, and it expanded. That is one of the really awesome things about React. It is declarative. You just simply say, I want to have a list there. And you give it an array, it will expand that list and render it for you. So this is, in my view, one of the real coolest things about React. It's truly declarative. Just put my list items there. What's in list items? I don't know right now. But if you find something in list items, put it there. Okay. So this is great. Our React is now expanding our list. So if I add things to my list, it works, automatically expands it. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about state, because right now I've got a list, but I can't change anything in my list, can I? We're talking about state. So let's add ourselves one thing. We're going to add a button to our little app here. Let's add a button. Come on, button. And click me. Say click me. Me. And no N. Okay, a button they call it with click me. Doesn't do anything, to no surprise. Okay. I want this button to do something. Now, normally in jQuery, I would have added maybe a class or an ID to that button and then had a handler in my document ready that said, oh, dollar, dot button or pound button on click something. Okay. With React, it is a little different. And in my view, it's much easier. You can simply put this right here. You can say on click equals, and then give it some function. This, by the way, this is just JavaScript. Nothing in here is React, okay? The on click is built into a button in HTML, okay? But I'm going to give it a function to execute when I click. So let's make a function that I want to execute when I click my button. All right. Make a function. I'll call it on click. The function can be called anything you want. I'm going to call it on click because I have no imagination, and kind of that's what it is. It's the on click. On click. Okay. And when I click, I want to, I'm going to just do a console log at this point. There, console log clicked. Okay. So now I can add my function there. On click equals on click. Okay. Got a red line there. Have I forgotten something? Oh, hover over that. Oh, look at that. JSX value should be an expression or quoted JSX text. Very helpful. Yes, I've forgotten the curly brace. There. Now it's happy again. Okay. So now I have a button and an on click. This is a very common pattern you'll see in React. Okay. Let's go to our console. Go higher. And we'll click on our button and see what happens. Okay. And in fact, we get clicked. So great. We now have a function on click that we hooked up to our button on click. This is pretty old stuff. This is not jQuery or React or EJS. This is plain. We call this is the framework called Vanilla JS. It's a very cool framework, Vanilla JS, which means no framework, no library. This is built into the browser. On click equals on click. Okay. Let's make our on click do something. Why don't we? Okay. Let us, why don't we do this? This is cool. Let's make our list items an empty array to start with. There. There. And when we click, we're going to actually change our list items. Go list items equals there. And we'll put it in there. Make it into a new array like that. There. That's really interesting. There we go. Okay. Great. So what should happen is when I click this, it should change list items, which means it hopefully should change my list. Let's give that a try. And nothing happened. It didn't change. It was clicked. That's okay. Let's do something else. Let's console log list items. Maybe we made a mistake. Let's console log our list items, just to confirm that we have in fact changed those list items. Okay. There it is. Oh, yeah, it's there. Look at that. We have in fact changed the list items, but nothing got rendered. It's still an empty list. And the reason for that is something called state. Okay, there is what's called state in a React page or in any page. A state in React terms is something that can change on the page. So anything that can change on the page is what's called state. In this case, my list could change. That is state. And I cannot simply change the variable of list items because React has no way of knowing that that changed because it wasn't held in state. A React component is a function that returns JSX. So even if I was to change list items on my on click, and I clearly did, it did change. If this function was to run again, because that is how a function or a component is rendered, if this component rendered, it would run my function all over again. And the first thing it does, it sets list items back to an empty array. So even if I had re-rendered, it wouldn't matter, because the very first thing that happens in my function, it sets list items equal to an empty array. So it doesn't matter that in the previous action, I changed it. If this function ran again, it resets list items back to an empty array, okay? But of course, it's not even a rendering. React doesn't even know that I clicked. Let's prove that. Let's actually put a console log at the very beginning of our function. I would say rendering app component. Okay. Rendering app component. The function ran. This means the component rendered. Very important term. It rendered. It showed on the browser. Okay. Let's click something. You notice it didn't render again. So even though I did in fact change list items, nothing happened. React didn't respond. React didn't know that anything had happened. So I can click this many times as I want. It doesn't matter, because React has no way of knowing that I changed something, that I want something to render again. And the way we handle that in React applications is with using state. Anything that you want to be changing on your page, or anything you need to change on your page, needs to be in state. So I need to keep my list items in state. And we do that by using a thing called a React hook. And the hook is called use state. You'll hear this term hooks a lot in React. It just means they're built-in functions. Why they call them hooks? Because it's a cool name. They're React functions. In this case, it's the React function or the React hook called useState. And we use it like this. I'm going to go const my list items. So let's move that out of the way. List items. Now, we're not going to declare a single item now. We actually need to have two of those, list items and set list items equals use state. Use state. And use state is a function. And this initializes some data for me in React. And it puts it in a place that will be safe and that will survive a re-render. And I can give it an initial value. I can say use state, and let's start off with an empty array. Now, this is a very common pattern in React. Now, does anybody recognize this particular pattern? It's called array destructuring. This is not React. Remember I talked about, it's not the React that gets you, it's the JavaScript. This is just JavaScript. The use state function returns an array. We have destructured that array into its two components. You get a variable or a value, and you get a function to change that value. That is what use state returns you. I've just split that off into two items called list items and set list items. All right. Tomorrow, we'll go over that in a little more detail, more about use state, and they'll kind of dive a bit deeper into it. Okay. All right. So now I have list items and set list items. It's an empty array. So my list item starts off as an empty array. If I do a click, I get an error. Invalid assignment to const list items. Okay. Look at that. I can't do that because it's a const. Well, I can fix that. Make it a let. Sure. Let's try it again. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. In fact, it didn't render. I know that because this didn't run again. So even though I'm doing it the correct way, it's still not rendering because I cannot simply assign a value back to this variable. I need to use the set function that I got back from useState. So instead of list items equals, I have to say set list items. Set list items, and it is a function. So I'm going to give it this array. Okay. And I spelled it wrong. Set list with one L. Okay, great. Okay, set list items to that array. Okay. So now when I click my button, I'm going to call my onClick function. It's going to console log clicked. It's going to set list items to a new array with stuff in it. See what happens. And it worked. Okay. I did in fact get my array. Now I did get a warning. It says each child must have a unique key prop. We'll talk about that in a second as to why that happened. Okay. But for now, it worked. So that's how state works. If you want something to change on your page, it needs to be in state. And anything you have on your page will survive a re-render. Anything in state will survive a re-render. That's an important point. We'll talk about something a little later. Okay. So let's do something else. Let's say we have some data that we want to get from, let's say, an API, maybe a Kanye API or an Office API, some quotes. So we know for a fact that Kanye does not send his quotes with LI in them, does he? That's not how he sends them. He sends them as an object with like an object ID and some other stuff. So we'll probably get back something that's a little more hard to understand. We can't render exactly. So let's just put some test data. I think I've got some here. Here we go. Let's put some dummy data, just the top here. Okay, there we go. Here's some really cool quotes that we might get back from an API. My biggest regret is that I will never be able to see myself perform live. My music isn't just music, it's medicine. In my body, where the shame gland should be, is just another awesome gland. True story. That's not Kanye. Who is that? Name that quote. Anybody? Come on. No? Let's guys think about that one. Okay. I love inside jokes. I hope to be part of one someday. Yes. Who said that? That's for Thursdays. And I'm sorry, I think you've mistakenly given me the food that my food eats. All right. So some memorable quotes from some of our favorite characters. Okay. So this is what we get back from API. But I can't use this, can I? I can't simply take this test data and render that, can I? Yeah, Ron Swanson. Yeah, that's a cool one. Okay. So I have this test data. But what I really want is I want this, isn't it? This is what I want. I want to get some LIs. So I have an array that looks like this. But what I really want is an array that looks like that. So is there a way that I can change this array into this array? If only JavaScript had some way of converting one array to another. If only JavaScript could let me map one array to another, okay? And of course, I would use the map function. Very, very common pattern in React is map. The map function will be your best friend in React. Don't use it everywhere, but for mapping lists, we use map. Very, very common. You'll be doing this a few times in your scheduler app. So what I want to do is, in fact, set list items I want to, instead of setting it to a hard-coded array, I want to set it to something else. I want to set it to test data. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable. Let's call it, I don't know, new array equals, I'm going to map my test data dot map. And that is the function we use. And the map function takes a callback. So for each item, I will do the following thing. And anything I return from the callback is what gets added to my array. So in this case, I'm going to return. Well, I need li, don't I? So li. I need an li. And I need the quote in that. Let's put the quote. Okay. And we'll set our list items to our new array. Okay. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to click on my button. It's going to call my onClick function. That's going to console log clicked. And it's going to give me a new array, which is going to have all the quotes with LIs around them. Then I'm going to set my list items to a new array. And since my list items is here, it should show me 5 quotes, but it doesn't. I get the word quote. Rule number 1, have to have curly braces around anything in there. And it's item dot quote. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, click me and look at that. I get some amazing quotes from our favorite people. Okay, let's watch what happened here. I clicked on my button on click. I'm calling this function called onClick. It console log click. Then it makes a new array by mapping my test data, which is great. That's fine, test data. And for each item, puts li in front. So now I've got a new array. I'm going to set my list items. I'm going to set my state equal to that. And that's all that's going to happen. Then React re-renders. React notices something has changed. Another important point. When you change some state, React goes, oh, something happened. I just noticed that. React noticed that something has changed. It then re-renders. Let's watch that happen in our console log. When I click me again, it renders again. It did my click. It did set my new array. And there's all my LIs in there. And then it set my state right there. Set list items, which is setting state. React noticed, oh, something has changed. It re-renders, which means when you re-render, it runs the whole component function again from the very top, line 12. It runs rendering out component. It did. Then it got this, and it's going to be a const again. We don't normally write let with these things. It ran this again. Use state gave me back the last thing I saved using that, and it gave me a function. So the next time use state ran, it goes, you've got something saved there. Let me give that back to you. So now list items is what got saved from my previous click. It didn't get lost again. Then it sets my on click. Then I got my return, and it renders my list. Now here's an interesting way or cool way to organize your React apps. We try to usually put our state stuff at the beginning. So we like to put our hooks at the beginning. In this case, state. Then I'll put, my functions, little things like my on click. And then I have my list, and then you have your return. The return is like Showtime. The return is what ends up on the browser. So anything you return, this stuff is what ends up being rendered in your browser. So think of it as the curtain lifting in a play. You're getting all ready, you're getting all the actors all set. All that's done in this part of your component. This is like the pre-work, all getting sets built. Your actors learning their lines. You're, getting, things built. And then it's time for the show. That's the return. I do encourage people, try not to be doing a lot of stuff once the show starts. Get everything ready before. In this case, I built my list before. You cannot do things like if statements or while statements or for loops inside JSX. So don't even try. You could do, however, a map if you wanted to, but I would discourage you from doing that. Do all of your work outside of your return. You wouldn't have a play with the curtain lifting and you've got a guy up there banging away on a set, like, oh, just a minute, hold on, people, I'm not done yet. Of course, you wouldn't do that. You would have everything all built before the movie or the show starts, and then you would lift the curtain. So try to do as much as you can before your return. Next thing is this list items. That's kind of the star of my show. So really, what I want to do is to have the star as really the last thing I set up before that. Let's take a look. So now you notice what I'm doing? I'm doing a map inside the click. We don't need to do that. What we can do is we can actually move this outside, just like this. Can't we? Okay. So now this new array, he's a star of our show. He has his own spot. So all my on-click really needs to do is simply set my data, isn't it? So instead of having this as state here, I've got my new array. Let's call it my star list. He's a star of my show. Star list. Okay. And I'll render my star list. Okay. So now my list items, I'll call this my data. There. Call it my data. And set data. And now I simply set data to my test data. Much simpler. There. So now all my on-click does, when I click, it simply just populates my data. Okay. And now when I map, I'm mapping my data. So let's see what happened here. When I click my button, it's going to call my on-click, which is now a very simple function. It's simply taking some test data and populating my state with it. And that's it. That's all this on-click has to do. It's now no longer doing more than one thing. We do talk about separation of concerns in programming. Functions should do one thing. I had it doing two things before. Now it's doing only one thing, just setting my test data. And then when my function, my component runs, it's going to map my data into a list and then render that list. And now the star of my show, that's my star list or my item list, is being built just before it gets rendered. Okay. So this is how lists work in React and state. It's very common. You'll see it this way. Okay. Let's do a couple more things. We have a few more minutes more. We'll talk a little bit about inputs, and we'll talk about props. We'll probably go about 10 or 15 minutes over the usual time. This is usually a longer lecture for React. So we'll talk about input components, which is a controlled component, and we'll talk about props. And we always talk about state as well at the same time. Let's make ourselves an input component. Input. This is just HTML. Okay, there. I have an input component. Click me. With an input component, I need two things. I need a value as to what's going to be inside it and what to do when someone types something. Right now, I can simply type. Now in jQuery, what I would normally have done is I would have had a onChanged listener, wouldn't I, to this? When something changed, I would simply run a function which would, in this case, or in the case of Tweeter, count the characters. It's done a little bit differently in React, and it's actually done in a way that makes it really easy to read. I'm going to have value equals, I'll start with an empty string. Okay. Value equals empty string. But now when I type something, nothing happens. Why? Because value is always empty string. It cannot change. So there is no way for the value to change ever. Okay. And I'm also getting a warning from React saying you only have a value, you don't have an on change. Okay. So you probably need to have an on change handler for this function. That's what this error is saying. It's very useful. It doesn't come as an error because it's not an error. It's a warning from React telling me I need to have an on change function. Let's add that. On change equals, and it wants a function. I'll just give it a blank for now. Okay. All right. And by the way, if you see that nasty red stuff come on your screen sometimes in React, just refresh your page. It could just be that React got confused, or in this case, actually Webpack and Babel got confused. There may be nothing wrong with your screen. You'll see this a few times in my code. I'll have a nasty red error, but just refresh the page. Sometimes it'll go away. You'll notice because the font is sometimes larger. It doesn't look like a normal React error. Refresh your page. Oftentimes it'll go away. All right. I need an onChange function. Let's make ourselves an onChange function. Call it onChange. And once again, the name can be anything I want. It takes an event parameter. Okay. And what I'm going to do when something changes, when I type something, I need to handle that keystroke. Okay. So what I need to do is to handle what is being entered. Now my value right now is an empty string always. It looks like I want that to change, don't I? So I need to put something in state because my value of my input is going to change. I need some place to put that. I need some state. So let's make a state called input, for lack of a better name, and set input. The name can be anything we want, input. And we'll start off with an empty string. Okay. And now we'll say value equals our input instead. Okay. So now we're still getting an error. Oh, because we have no function. We need to make our onChange equal to our onChange function, like that. Okay. And now I can type stuff, nothing happens, which means I need to handle my onChange. To do that, we go set input, and we set it to event.target.value. How did I know that? I just looked it up one time, and then we do it often enough. It's just that's what it always is. This is like, res.rows in PSQL. You just know it is. Okay, it's always event.target.value. This is a very, very common pattern that you will see in React all the time. On change, set your state value to event target value. And now when I type stuff, look at that, things change. Let's watch what's actually happening here, because this is really important and very cool. Take a shot. Very cool. Okay, let's watch what happens here. You notice that when I type a letter in my input, I'm typing letter D, I got rendering app component. Just by typing in that D, the whole component ran again, the whole thing from top to bottom. That was because I said on change equals call my on change function, which did a set input. That's a change of state. And React will re-render whenever state changes. And a re-render is running the whole function all over again. So I type an A, it ran again. So it's re-rendering every time I type something. And look at the really interesting part. Every time it runs, it gets to here, but then it runs this return again. It builds a whole new div. It reconstructs my entire DOM, my entire virtual DOM again from scratch. A brand new div, a brand new input with input equal to, with value equal to input. And input is changed. So it's actually rendering a whole new input control for me. When I type something, that old one's gone. This is now a new one, at least in the virtual DOM. It's disappeared, was replaced by a new input with a new value inside it. That's really, really interesting part of React. It's constructing a whole new input. When I typed a D, brand new input. Of course, it's in the virtual DOM. The browser, that's fine. It didn't touch that input. It simply patched it by adding a D to its value. In the virtual DOM, a whole new input was created from scratch. This whole DOM was destroyed and a brand new one was built. Remember we talked about React or JavaScript can construct 10,000 objects in the time it takes to update one thing in the real DOM. So this is unbelievably fast. So it may seem wasteful, it doesn't matter. It's just incredibly fast. It's the magic of virtual DOM that actually showed that V there. As far as the browser is concerned, it got a V. But React rebuilt the whole DOM right from scratch with a brand new value and a brand new input. Okay, really interesting thing to consider. Okay, so this is how a controlled component works. It has two parts. Its value is based on the data. So the value of that input is based on the data. Okay. Tomorrow, I think it's Kristen, Andy, talking more about state and more in-depth work of state. He'll talk about this some more. So we go over this again tomorrow. So don't worry. Let's do one more thing. We have about 10 minutes left. We'll talk about props, because I know props is always what gets people. Okay, is props. What are props? Why are they so hard? Why do they seem so hard? Why do they drive me crazy? And how do I use these things called props? Okay. So to use props, you will only see props when you have more than one component. Right now we have one component, that is our app component. So let's clean this up. We move our list. We'll make our app a little bit simpler now. So we'll get rid of our, there. Do that for now. We don't need our list. I'm just gonna clean things up a bit. There we go. A little bit of a cleaner app. Okay. Right, so click me just as clicked. Now let's say we wanted to have a component. Let's take this input and that button And let's make this kind of its own component, because that's what we normally do. They kind of belong together. Like, let's do one more thing. Let's put some state here, and we'll call it, I don't know, text. Why not? Text and set text. It's something I want to change. So we're going to actually set our text here. And we'll start off with an empty string. I'm going to put some text right underneath this. We'll make a div. And we'll put the text right there. There we go. Okay. Now, of course, I have nothing here. Nothing on my text, but there's actually hidden text there. What I'm going to do when I click my button, a simple example, when I click my button, I'm going to change that text. Why not? Set text. So set text to hello world. That's way overused. Okay. When I click my button, it's going to set text to hello world. It did. Okay. Once again, click the button, set text, change state, re-render, whole function ran again. The whole DOM was rebuilt again. And look, there's some text, which now is equal to hello world. Okay. Let's make this its own component, shall we? We'll call it an input component. We normally put a component in its own file. I'll make a file, call it input, capital I, input.js. You could also call it .jsx, completely up to you. You will see both. I'm using JS because that's what my Create React app use. You can also call it .jsx. That is your choice. Really makes no difference at all. Okay. Okay. We're going to make a new component. What is a component? Well, a component is a function, isn't it? We'll call it input. Okay. Now I have a function, but it's not a React component yet. A React component is a function that what? It returns JSX. So let's return JSX. There. We'll return a fragment for now. There. We have the world's simplest, absolute simplest React component. But of course, I have to export that. Let's export. Can't use it. Export, default, and input. There. So now we have a React component that we can use. So this is as simple as it gets for a React component. A function that returns JSX, in this case, a fragment. Not very useful. So let's put some stuff in our component. Let's take out the button and the input. Why not? That we had, we're going to take it out of there. Let's put it inside our component. Now you will oftentimes see the return using round braces. Very common. Okay. But now I'm getting the error saying must have one parent. So it looks like I probably should have kept my fragment in there, shouldn't I? Okay. There. Okay. Now I have a function returns JSX, but I got a couple errors like, oh, what's going on here? Oh, look at that. Okay. I need my state. Ah, no problem. I'll take my input state. Let's just take that and put it here as well. And VS Code has a cool trick, by the way. If you go use and you pick use state, it will do an import for you automatically. Saves a lot of typing, I discovered. Okay, good. Set input, empty string. Okay. That's one thing. And now, oh, I need an on change and an on click. Okay, let's copy those things too. I've got my on change function. I can take that out and let's put that in my input component. There. Looking better. I need an on click. Okay, I need an on click function. Let's take that out of there. Okay. set text. Oh, I don't have any text here. I can put a text here. I can do that. But that's going to cause me a problem, I think. Let's take a look. Sure, now I have set text here. But this is a different text. And on my main app, I want to render my text here. Huh. Let's carry on, see what happens. All right, let's try and use our input component. So to use a component, right now we've written a component. Now we're going to use a component. We'll use it by simply go input. Now let's see if is it smart enough? Did it? Wasn't smart enough. Sometimes you can convince VS Code to actually import your component. Oh, it did. Look at that. Okay. That's one of the really interesting things about VS Code. You can actually, if you're careful, you can go ahead and it will write your input statements for you. And it did. Import, input from input. Great. Okay. Okay. Great. And I have a component. So now I've simply got an input and then a div. And this is a component that I wrote. When you write React components, you're writing your own pointy bracket stuff. You're creating your own, really your own HTML. So now pointy bracket input. I've created a component called input that does some stuff. And look at all the renderings happening. Great. Okay. But when I click me, my text didn't render. Why not? Because this input has its own text now. It's of no use to me. So I'm rendering this text. And by the way, I don't need this anymore, so I can clean this up. I don't need this on change there. Okay. But I have a problem. Okay. So let's talk about props. First thing I want to do is I want this input to be a little more general purpose. I want my button to say anything, not just click me. I'd like it to say something more useful. Maybe, click me, maybe click now, maybe search. So to do that, I have to use what are called attributes. When you call a component, you can call it with attributes. They're just like parameters. And let's say I want to have something called button text equals, and we want it to say search. There. Okay. Well, that's all great. Of course, nothing changed. I can add any attribute I want in XML, in this case, HTML. Doesn't matter. It's ignored because it's not being used. So now we have to talk about how to use that attribute on the component side. Here I'm sending the parameter or the attribute button text. I have to be able to use that parameter on or in the component. And we do that using props. So this is the magic of props, and it's really not that magic. Your components do have an optional parameter called props or anything. It doesn't have to be called props, it's called properties. It really doesn't matter, but you'll almost always see it called props. Okay, we have props. Inside props, props is an object, and it will contain anything that you add as an attribute. If I say A equals 1, B equals 2, and button text equals search, I'm going to get those things inside my props. And it will look like props dot that thing. Props dot A, props dot B, props dot button text. So let's go ahead and change my button. I'll put props dot button text. And of course, I get the word props dot button text. Rule number 1 of JSX, it's got to have curly braces. There. And now it says search. That's great. So now my input component is more general purpose. I can now use it in a number of instances. Search, maybe I want to say login. Let's say login. And it says login. That's great. And of course, I could have A and B, which I won't use. Okay, so here's the secret of props, and it's really not so complicated. If it exists as an attribute when you call the component, it's going to be a prop when you're in the component. So if it's button text equals something here, inside that component, it's going to be props dot button text. It's a one-to-one. If I have A equals, I'll have props dot A. So it seems simple here, but it can get complicated because you're passing props down a tree. In your scheduler app this week, you'll be passing props down a couple times. Sometimes they change names as you go down. Maybe you're passing props here. Maybe inside my input, I've got another component and I pass this props.button text as something else. So it takes a bit of practice to be able to trace the props as you go in your components. Right now, input button text equals login. The text is login. So there had better be a props.login. Put another way, if I'm using the input component, input.js, it says it's got props.button text. So if I want to use this component input, I had better have button text equals something. If I don't, I'm going to get an empty button. Okay. So that's how props works. Something else I can add is I can add behavior. We're passing values down to our component. So we pass values down, but I want this button to do something because it doesn't do anything yet. It doesn't change my text. It changes its own text. So maybe I can't use that text. It doesn't do anything to me. What I need to do is I need to change the text up in the parent that called my input. And to do that, the parent has to pass me a function to allow me to change it. So the common way to do that is you give your input another prop. Now I can call it onClick equals, and I can give it a function. Now I happen to have an onClick function here that sort of works, and it might work. So now I'm passing a function down to my component, and that function is named or exists in an attribute called onClick. That means inside the component, there's probably a props.onClick. Well, great, because now I can just say onClick equals props.onClick, and I don't need an onClick at all. So now I'm calling the props onClick, the conclick that I was given by my parent. Great. So now my component doesn't even need to worry about what to do with the button. That will be given as a prop in the component. Okay, onClick equals props onClick. Okay, let's try it. Let's type, this is a test, and we'll click. We got hello world. Uh-oh, why was that? That wasn't what I expected. I expected to see this as a test. Let's take a look. Okay. So I've got my input. Well, that's just calling my props onClick. So there's nothing happening here. There's no hello world at all in here. But oh, look at this. I'm setting text equal to hello world. Ah, okay. That's a bit of a problem to me because I don't really want to do that. What I want to get the value that was inside this input. Okay, so it looks like my onClick is going to need to send the information to my parent. So it looks like I can't call that onClick directly. I'm going to need an onClick function again. That's probably going to call props.onClick. It's going to call props.onClick. So I'm going to call this one there. It's going to call the props.onClick, but I want to call it with my input. That will send the input back up to the parent. That's great. I've solved my problem. I'm sending my input back up. I'm calling props input, and now I'm going to give it a parameter. So in my app.js, now my onClick is going to get my input. And now I can set my text equal to that input, just like that. Okay. Once again, we'll be going over this again tomorrow. So there's a lot to unpack here. We're doing really a whole, almost all of React without doing use effect and stuff today. So there's a lot to cover. We will do this again tomorrow and again on Wednesday, and then I'll be back on Thursday. I'll do some more cool stuff. So see if this works. So let's clear my screen. I'll say this is a test, and now I get this as a test. That's because I have my input. Button text equals login, onClick equals onClick. Once again, these names are only coincidentally the same. Okay, I could have made my function called here onClicky and named my function onClicky. The names are irrelevant. I could have called this, do onClick. But now I need to make sure that the input has a props.doOnClick. So I'll leave it onClick for now. The names have to match, but the function, when you're inside, it's your function. You can call it anything you want because you're inside your component. Okay. So when I click my onClick inside my input component, there's my onClick again. It's calling its onClick function. That is in turn calling the props.onClick function that was given to it, and is calling it with the input, which I know is what's getting changed in my input. It sends that back up to my parent's onClick, and it ends up as a parameter there. And I set text, and it does work. Okay. So props does take a bit of getting used to. Just don't overthink it with props. It's easy to overthink how props work. Just remember, if you have an attribute called button text here, there is guaranteed there had better be a props.buttonClick inside your component. Okay, a button text, and there is. Okay. Any questions on React? We've covered kind of the fundamentals. We will be doing this again and again this week. It's a lot of repetition because there is a lot to unpack for React to begin with. So, okay. All right. We'll talk a little more about props tomorrow. And state, we'll talk about props.children. Didn't cover that today, which is another prop. So, all right, I'll be around all week. There's lots of questions in React Week. Don't hesitate to ask in an AR if you have questions about React as well. All right, everyone.